some of you may remember, Israel invaded Lebanon. It was after Hezbollah had crossed over the border into northern Israel and killed 3 Israeli soldiers, and they abducted 2. And Israel responded by really destroying Lebanon. It was about a three-week invasion. They displaced over 1 million people, destroyed much of the infrastructure, and killed, I think, somewhere around 1,000 people. And I saw this action by Israel, which came, by the way, 3 weeks after Hamas on the Israel-Gaza border had captured Israeli soldier Gilad Shalit. I saw these actions as proof, as confirmation for me, that the Arab world would not rest until Israel was wiped from the face of the earth. And so I started complaining to my friends, and to my 2 of my wisest friends, neither of whom were Jewish, and who had generally been critical of Israel, and I knew that, but this time I was sure that they would agree with me. It was so obvious, and they didn't. And they blamed Israel for its disproportionate use of force against the people of Lebanon. And what happened was it got me so upset that I started complaining to my Jewish friends. And one of my Jewish friends, who actually I hadn't been complaining to, I was living in New Mexico at the time, and he was in New Jersey, and I hardly ever speak to him, but he called me from New Jersey to tell me he was coming out here to Denver to attend the bar mitzvah of a mutual friend of ours who he was very close to. And then he said, I'm coming down to visit you. And then I launched into a 2-hour diatribe against the Arab world, and he just listened. He hardly said a word, but I knew that he had studied the issue for many years, and he was very low-key about it. And occasionally he would interrupt me and say, no, that's not right. But he didn't judge me. He let me speak, and he basically gave me a space to just express myself. And then towards the end of my diatribe, he said, why don't you read some books by these 2 Israeli scholars who were very well respected. They're professors. I'd never heard of them, but I wrote their names down. And when we hung up, I thought to myself, you know what, I've never studied this issue. Maybe there's something I don't know. And the only book I had studied was the book I mentioned in the film, which was called From Time Immemorial by Joan Peters, which I didn't know, and I didn't want to know, but that book had been debunked as trash by Israeli scholars in Israel and in the United States and in Europe. So after I got off the phone with my friend Sam, I compiled a list. I went to Amazon and looked up books by those 2 Jewish Israeli scholars that Sammy had given me. And when you go to Amazon, you look up one book, it lists other books that other people bought that were in the same genre. So I compiled a list of books on the Israel-Palestine subject, with the stipulation that I would read only Jewish authors, because I was afraid I would suspect bias otherwise. And then I drove over to the library, and I found a few of the books. And the main book, and then I came home the next day. I started reading, as I mentioned in that book, in the film. I was reading a book called Beyond Chutzpah. Chutzpah is the Yiddish word for nerve, for being kind of megalomaniacal. And so I started reading that book, Beyond Chutzpah, on the misuse of anti-Semitism and the abuse of history. And I knew right away when I was reading that book that the scholar, Norman Finkelstein, who I had never heard of, was a brilliant scholar. I could tell in the first paragraph. And I just kept reading, and as I'm reading, I went through all these emotions, starting with shock, then anger at Israel for what they were doing to these poor people, anger at myself for being so stupid for so many years, and demonizing the people, shame, embarrassment, and then immense sorrow for these people whose cries I'd been deaf to. But I was so absorbed in reading that I wasn't I wasn't resisting the emotions. They were just happening as I was absorbed. And then at a certain point, I put the book down. I needed a break. And what happened was I ended up, I didn't do it. I ended up having what is commonly referred to as a spiritual awakening. And my exclusive or limited presumed identity as a Jew dissolved. It was nowhere to be found. And then I realized I was as much Palestinian as Israeli, as much Muslim or Christian as Jew. And the fear that I wasn't even aware I had been living from, because the fear had manifested as anger and righteous indignation, but the fear was hidden beneath that. But that fear became transformed into compassion, and then confusion, and I never knew I was confused, but I was, the confusion that always accompanies fear, because fear colors the way you see the world, and it affects how you interpret events. It affects how you judge people. It makes you judge people. So the confusion that always accompanies fear was transformed into clarity. And I could see from 360 degrees, I could see from the point of view of all people. And then it was so easy then, once I had rediscovered my common humanity with all people, to really see what was going on. And from that point on, I was able to actually predict what people were going to say to me. People who were strong defenders of Israel, when I would talk to them, I knew what they were going to say to me before they said it. And I knew what Israel was going to do, because I ended up studying the subject so voluminously that I knew whenever there was an incident in Israel that was happening, I knew what was going to happen. I mean, I knew what the not resolution, but what the end game was, what Israel was going to do. So that's kind of my story in a nutshell. It's described in this book, and it so happens, because I was in this incredible state, that when I wrote this book, I didn't know I was doing it, but I've never heard an argument that I made or from anybody else that is not covered in this book, that is not clarified in this book. And this book does go into the root causes of suffering and conflict, which are the attachment to a limited, presumed, mortal identity, and to the beliefs and images that emanate from and reinforce that presumed identity. That's the root cause. Not territory, not religion, not culture. All of those things, it's not a humanitarian problem. All of those things are proximate causes, but the root, deepest, primal cause is the ego, is the unexamined mind that projects its suffering onto the other, and then blames or scapegoats the other for its suffering. So, anybody got any questions?